Check out FlipsideGaming.com for all your gaming needs. Use the promo code HEROES to save 10% on any purchase over $10. See the description below for details. Hey there, this is John from Heroes and Legends, and it's that time of the week again to look at the results from the big tournaments, and there are no tournaments bigger than the Mythic Championship, which occurred last weekend in Cleveland. We'll be looking at the results as well as many of the deck lists from that event, with a special focus on the cards from Ravnica Allegiance that performed well. Quickly before we get started, just a fast reminder, if you're looking for a way to support the channel, just check out the description below. You'll find a number of them there, including our Patreon page, product links for Amazon, and of course the promo code for Flipside Gaming, which can save you some cash but also help the channel. As always, thank you not only to the folks that look at those links, but to all of you. I appreciate each and every one of you, but let's get into today's results. Alright, so before we get to our top 8, let's take a look at what decks people brought to this tournament and how they converted into day 2. So this list is going to show you any deck that had at least 4 of that type in the tournament, and then we'll look at some of the outliers in just a moment. Let's start off by looking at the big decks though. Sultai Midrange, 107 copies in this environment. That's quite a few, 21.50% of the field. Nexus of Fate was the runner-up with 71 copies, 14.30% of the field. White Aggro had quite a few, 62. Mono Blue Tempo had a great weekend, more on that in a moment, 60 copies. Esper Control also had a good weekend, 45 copies. Is It Drake's 30 copies, Red Aggro 28, Rakdos Midrange 18, and then it starts to get a little more sparse. Selesnya Tokens 10, Gruel Midrange 10, and it goes down from there. But it does show you there's still a lot of diversity out there, and we're going to look at some diverse decks, not only deck lists in the top 8 in this video, but a few decks that still performed really well in Standard that maybe didn't get as much attention. Now, let's look at the conversion rates of these decks. Remember, though, there are 6 rounds of draft that are played in this tournament, too. So it's very possible that if somebody has a lot of good draft rounds, it could push a deck that maybe wasn't performing as well, or vice versa. If I had some bad draft rounds, my deck might look like it's not performing as well as it actually did. So remember that as we go through here. But when you have a lot of a certain copy of a deck in the field, then some of that smooths out a little bit because you have more data points. So let's look at the big decks first. Sultai Midrange, 21.60% in day 2 for a 63.60 conversion rate. 68 copies made it over. Pretty good. Nexus of Fate did even better. 51 copies in day 2, conversion rate 71.80. White Aggro had a 67.70 conversion rate, also very strong. Mono Blue Tempo a little lower at 60%, but don't worry about that deck. Esper Control, pretty good, 64.40%. Is It Drake's only 43.30, so a little bit lower there. Red Aggro, 60.70%. Rakdos Midrange, 50%. Now we're starting to get into the low numbers, so the conversion percentage doesn't quite mean as much, but you do have some interesting things to look at here. Selesnya Tokens, 7 out of the 10 decks made it for 70%. Gruel Midrange, 8 out of the 10 decks made it for 80%. Is It Phoenix? Look at that, 7 for 7, 100%. Esper Midrange also had 80%, 4 out of 5 decks made it there. Let's look at some of the outliers just for fun. Alright, here you go. If you want some indie decks, these are them. Abzan Angel shows up here, Golgari Midrange, of course, very similar to Sultai Midrange, but obviously not running the Crasises, which is not something a lot of people want to do. In fact, only 3 people brought that version of the deck to the tournament, although 2 of them did make it to day 2. Merfolk, we're going to look at one of the Merfolk deck lists a little bit later. That was kind of sweet. A lot of other mid-range decks here. You have Dimir Tempo, Orzhov Midrange shows up, Sultai Reclamation at the very end here. So a lot of different things you can do in this particular format. Granted, some of them are variations of other decks, but there is a lot happening here. Alright, without any further ado, here is your top 8. Congratulations to Autumnbird Chat. They won the tournament with Mono Blue Aggro. Very impressive looking deck this weekend. I do want to point out that the Star City game slides refer to this deck as Mono Blue Aggro, where the Wizard slides we just looked at refer to it as Mono Blue Tempo, but it is the same deck. I don't want anyone to be confused by that. That deck also came in 3rd as well as 7th place. 2nd place, Esper Control. 4th place, Is It Phoenix? 5th place, Azorius Aggro. 6th place, Simic Nexus, and 8th place, Gruel Aggro. Okay, let's take a look at some of these deck lists. If you've been following the tournament scene, many of these will look familiar to you. Beginning with this 1st place Mono Blue Aggro deck. Yep, it is the deck that we saw actually over the last couple seasons perform very well, but some new cards have enhanced this deck considerably. We'll look at those in just a moment. But let's look at the core cards first that were already here. Tempest Djinn, 4 of those. 4 Siren Storm Tamer. Only one Mistcloaked Herald in this particular version of the deck. 4 Merfolk Tricksters are here. You're also going to find a lot of familiar non-creature spells here with things like Curious Obsession, Dive Down, Wizard's Retort, Charted Course, Entrancing Melody, 1 copy in the main here, 3 in the sideboard. That turned out to be a really important card this weekend. It's not the perfect answer to Hydroid Crisis because, yes, when the player plays the Crisis, even if it gets countered, they can still draw cards, they can still gain life. So it doesn't completely nullify the impact of that card, but it does give you an option to take the card for a reasonable cost and be able to turn the tables on your opponent a little bit. And that alone was good enough for this card to shine this weekend. As for the cards from Ravnica Allegiance here, Pteramander has been the key card that really pushed this deck. 4 copies. Essence Capture was also in the main, and another copy of Essence Capture in the sideboard. Now, this deck wasn't doing it, but the 7th place deck was running a copy of Fairy Duelist in the sideboard. We saw a little bit of that happening over the last couple weekends as well. Here's your 2nd place Esper Control deck. Now, this has a copy of Karn Scion of Urza in the main, 4 copies of Teferi Hero of Dominaria. Perhaps another potential finisher with a copy of the Eldest Reborn in the main. You get another one of those in the sideboard as well. Also, if you want to go a little more creature heavy in Game 2 or Game 3, check out the sideboard. You're going to find some creatures there. Hostage Taker, 3 copies. 4 Thief of Sanity. 2 Lyra Dawnbringers. Another card in the sideboard I thought was interesting. 1 copy of Kaya Orzhov Usurper. That card had its moments this weekend. Let's look at the new cards, though, that are coming from Ravnica Allegiance. You have Cry of the Carnarium in the main. Now, the next card is probably your best reason to play some Esper Control over some of the other variants, and that's Kaya's Wrath. Amazing card. Absorb is here, Mortify, Godless Shrine, and Hallowed Fountain. And as I mentioned previously, 1 copy of Kaya Orzhov Usurper in the sideboard. 4th place was the Is It Phoenix deck, and you're going to see LSV was not taking a lot of risks with this one. This deck is pretty much the old Is It Phoenix deck. There's one new card we'll look at in just a second, but look what you have here. 4 Arclight Phoenix, 4 Crackling Drake, 4 Goblin Electromancer. You got your cheap spells here. Entrancing Melody, 1 copy in the main, that's worth pointing out, another couple copies in the sideboard. You have 4 Shocks, you have 4 Ops, you have 4 Radical Idea, you have a Beacon Bolt in here, 4 Charter Course. Nothing too shocking, right? You've seen it all before. Even a copy of Ral Is It Viceroy in the main and another copy in the sideboard. So what came from Ravnica Allegiance? Well, just the Blood Crypt, and the only reason that was even in here is if you just wanted to play the other side of Discovery Dispersal at some point. Alright, 5th place was Azorius Aggro, but this isn't a very Azorius feeling aggro deck. We've seen some of these decks that do push blue a little more in the past. However, the sideboard does bring in some blue cards for some control elements. Things like Disdainful Stroke, Negate, Spell Pierce. But at its heart, this is really one of those white aggro decks that we've seen for a while now. Adanto Vanguard, a couple of those. 4 Banalish Marshal, 4 Dauntless Bodyguard, 4 Sky Marcher Aspirant, 4 History of Benalia, 4 Legion's Landing. 1 copy of Ajani Adversary of Tyrants in the main, 2 in the sideboard. We've kind of seen this before, right? Let's take a look at the new cards, though, that contribute here. Tithe Taker, this particular version of the deck, running 4 copies. We also have Hallowed Fountain. And out of the sideboard, Unbreakable Formation. 6th place was Simic Nexus. Over the last few weekends, people were trying to figure out which was the best Nexus deck. Was it going to be the Bant Nexus deck, 4-color Nexus, Nexus of Gates? Well, the pros decided last weekend it was Simic Nexus, and they do have the 6th place finish now to back it up. So let's take a look at this deck. 2 copies in the main of Hydroid Crisis. We'll take a closer look at that card in a moment. Also 1 in the sideboard. Look at the non-creature spells to your right here, and you're going to see a lot of cards that fit into a lot of these Nexus decks. Of course, 4 copies of Nexus of Fate, 3 Search for Azcanta, 3 Sinister Sabotage, 4 Chemist's Insight. Let's look at the cards from Ravnica Allegiance, though, that are here. Like I mentioned before, of course, Hydroid Crisis. Precognitive Perceptions here, Growth Spiral, Wilderness Reclamation, the card that's really pushed this deck, Breeding Pool, and Simic Guildgate. Out of the sideboard, other than that additional Hydroid Crisis copy I mentioned, you have Biogenic Ooze and Incubation Druid. 8th place was Gruel Aggro, but much like that Azorius Aggro deck, is this really a Gruel deck? If you look at the main deck, no, it's not. It's a red aggro deck. But out of the sideboard, you do have a couple of the new cards that do bring some green in, and we'll look at those in a second. But let's look at that main deck first. Fanatical Firebrand, 4 of those. Get 2 Lava Runner, 4 of those. 3 Goblin Chainwhirler, 4 Runaway Steamkins. You've seen this all before, right? 4 Shocks, 4 Lightning Strike, 4 Wizard's Retort. Let's look at the new cards. Light Up the Stage, 4 copies of that, as well as Stomping Ground here. Out of the sideboard, here's your green, Collision Colossus and Cindervines. Okay, we looked at the top 8. Let's look at a few other standard decks that performed exceptionally well, but did not make the top 8. If you take the limited rounds out, the decks that performed the best were Esper Control, Simic Nexus, and Sultai Midrange. Maybe not too surprising. However, we're going to look at 4 decks that also performed really, really well and could have made the top 8 if it wasn't for the limited rounds. The first one is Gruel Aggro, which is kind of an Aristocrats deck. You could argue maybe it's an Aristocrats aggro deck. We'll take a look at the new cards from Ravnica Allegiance in a moment because there's a lot of them, but a couple other things I want to point out first. Angrath the Flame Chain, 1 copy in the main, also 1 copy in the sideboard. Look at your aggro elements here. There's cards like Adanto Vanguard and Tajic Legion's Edge. And another thing I want to point out in the sideboard before we move on, Kaya Orzhov Usurper again shows up, just 1 copy. Alright, here are your cards from Ravnica Allegiance, 10 of them, and this is where you're going to find a lot of your Aristocrats elements. Hero of Precinct 1, Gutterbones, Priest of Forgotten Gods, Fireblade Artist, Judith the Scourge Diva, Footlight Fiend, Mortify, Carnival and Carnage, Blood Crypt, and Godless Shrine. Other than the Kaya I mentioned, you have in the sideboard Drillbit, Unbreakable Formation, and Mortify, another copy. Alright, Merfolk. This deck performed extremely well this weekend. I kind of wish it could have made the top 8. That really would have caught a lot of attention, but it did awesome in the tournament. So let's see here. It's basically the old Merfolk deck with some upgrades. We'll look at those upgrades in just a second, but let's look at the core cards from before. Kamena, Tyrant of Araska, 4 copies. 4 copies of Silver Guild Adept. 4 Deeproot Elite. 4 copies of Deeproot Water. So this is one of those Merfolk decks that's going really deep into that strategy. And the deck looks super sweet. I love Merfolk Tribal. Hopefully we'll see more of this show up in some big tournaments down the road. Let's look at the new cards, though, that did enhance this build. Benthic Biomancer. This card was huge here to help you work through your deck. Incubation and Congruity. I remember when this thing got previewed, the first thing I thought was that would be amazing in a Merfolk deck. Happy to see it happen. 4 copies in the main. Breeding Pool was also here. Nothing in the sideboard, though. Temur Reclamation also putting up a pretty good result this weekend. Now, some of these variants will go a little more creature heavy. Some will go a little more burn heavy. This is kind of a cross between the two. Starting you out with 2 Niv Mizzet Apparent in the main, 1 more out of the sideboard, and then you have 4 copies of Expansion Explosion, something else you can do with your mana. Also, check out the sideboard for other creature options in Game 2 or Game 3. 2 Biogenic Ooze, 2 Rekindling Phoenix. Also notice the 2 Entrancing Melodies make it in here as well. And other than that, going back to the main, you have a lot of control elements. Shivan Fire, 4 Sinister Sabotage here, 2 Opt, 2 Syncopate. And of course, you have that engine card, which we'll look at in just a second. And here you go. Of course, that card is Wilderness Reclamation, 4 copies of that. You also have Growth Spiral, Breeding Pool, and Stomping Ground. Out of the sideboard, like I mentioned, Biogenic Ooze. Gruel Midrange. Okay, now this is a deck that looked pretty good last weekend. Yeah, this deck is very, very solid, even though if you're just looking at the top 8, you might overlook it. It is a mid-range deck. It does go a little heavier. You're going to have not only your fast creatures like Direfleet Daredevil or Goblin Chainwhirler, but you also have some bigger ones here to play around with. Rekindling Phoenix, 4 of those. 3 Skargon Hellkites. We'll look at that card in just a second. 4 Lightning Strikes, 2 Shocks, 2 Lava Coils. You get a Karn Sign of Urza in the sideboard there. Let's take a look at the new cards. Quite a few of them. The aforementioned Skargon Hellkite. Growth Chamber Guardian is here. Gruel Spellbreaker, awesome underrated card. One to watch in the coming weeks, I think. Collision Colossus, Gruel Guildgate, and Stomping Ground. And out of the sideboard, Cindervines. Alright, that concludes our look at the Mythic Championship, and I'll tell you, the diversity in the format looks really encouraging right now. If you want to play Control, you can. If you want to play Midrange, you can. If you want to play Aggro, you can. And there's a lot of different variants of those decks out there that at any given time can perform very well. There were actually a number of decks that we didn't even talk about in this video that might have been able to make the top 8 if the player was able to do a little bit better in Limited. So there's just so many options right now for players. I love to see that. Hopefully it remains healthy in the weeks to come. But until next time, hey, thanks for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe and have a great day. Hey, thanks for watching. This video is made possible through the generous support of viewers like you on Patreon. Check out the description below for links to our Patreon page as well as our Amazon affiliate store, where a small percentage of all sales will also help support the channel. Finally, if you haven't had a chance yet to subscribe, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of the new videos on Heroes and Legends. Talk to you again soon and have a great day.